Good evening, everybody. That's very different for me to be wearing a microphone. Normally I just shout louder, but Jake had said that if we wear this, then we can record it and we could possibly put together something for YouTube so that people who aren't here can hear it and see it later. So welcome to All Saints. The reason I said I would come and do a talk tonight is last year when we were doing the memorial service for Queen Elizabeth, Jake asked, the vicar asked if I would just talk very briefly about Pocklington and royalty. And I must admit, I did say then there wasn't really any record of the Queen having come to Pocklington. But there were two people here tonight who shot me down on that. Margaret Bella said that she remembered standing on the railway crossing down Burnby Lane and waving as the Queen's train shot past. And Alec here said when he was teaching at Pocklington School, when it was the Jubilee, they hauled their classes up to Canal Head and did the same thing and waved the flags as the cavalcade of motors went past. So while the Queen didn't necessarily spend time at Pocklington, she did come to Pocklington. Charles, I'm not so sure about. I mean, I know he's been to Garraby many times, and some of that has been quite, covered in the media quite strongly. However, and he's had one or two moments through his life, but I'll be telling a couple of tales tonight that's going to show you that really King Charles and his coronation is likely to be one of the least controversial in history. In addition, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, both Water Priory and Lonsborough were popular places for royal shooting parties, and so again we know that the King came through Pocklington on the train on the way for a shooting weekend. But while Pocklington might not have had any official royal visits in the 20th and 21st centuries, there was numerous times that the King, Queen and or Royal Army did come to Pocklington in medieval times, and particularly during the period of what's called the Angevine or Plantagenet kings. We know, for example, that Edward I came to Pocklington 3 times, and he had a particular interest because what he did was he wanted to establish a port at the mouth of the River Hull, and so he swapped his royal manor of Pocklington with the Abbot of Mews or Mow for their lands at the mouth of the Hull, which is why Pocklington has a key part in the founding of Kingstown upon Hull. And Edward I came here to Pocklington at least 3 times. His son, Edward II, had a particular notable time here at Pocklington because his royal favourite, Piers Gaveston, was murdered elsewhere by opposing barons, and the news was brought here to Pocklington to a crestfallen Edward II when he was camped here with his queen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk around the church and point out the major parts of connections to royalty. And I would hope that some of you would like to come round with me, but if you prefer, then feel free to just sit in your seats and swivel round, and I'll wave my arms about and speak from there. I'm going to start at the back, just looking up at the royal arms over the door, come down and then say a few words on the aisle there, and then spend more time in here, cross to that side, and then through the Lady Chapel and up to the chancel. So, like I say, you can follow me round, or sit in your seats, or go and have a look afterwards. You know, we're not in a hurry, and we'll go from there. So, okay. So I'll wander to the back and get started now. And if we're talking about royalty, the obvious place to start is underneath the royal arms, which are up there over the doorway. They were painted by a local man, Richard Scaife, in 1834, and they're the arms of William IV. I haven't been able to work out why that happened, because William IV was crowned in 1831, and I can't see that it took Richard Scaife 3 years to paint them. What I would like to do sometime, if anybody ever takes them down, is look and see what's on the back of that, because lozenge-shaped, diamond-shaped arms like that are usually what's called funerary escutcheons, and if it was a posh person, they would have their arms on that, and they'd put them on the wall of their house and then bring them to church sometime later. And so I do wonder if that was somebody else's arms that they found, and they turned it round and painted the other side. But those are the arms of William, and the other part on that is that it's very unlikely that they were originally, or their predecessors were over the main door. The royal arms were first Henry VIII, after the Reformation, announced that royal arms had to be displayed in church, and usually they went over the top of the chancel arch, and we know that painting did originally live over the top of the chancel arch there. The reason they did that, Henry obviously was declaring himself as head of the church, and in medieval times you had the priesthood were on. Pocklington looks pretty much the same as it would have done 500 years ago, except for the fact there would have been a big rood screen there, right across the chancel arch, and with a rood, which is a massive crucifix, at the top of it. And Henry got rid of those, but before that, the priesthood were on that side, and us plebs were on this side, and so they were separated. Henry wanted to make a statement that he was now head of this side of the church, and so he ordered that royal arms should be over the chancel arch. They will have then obviously disappeared during Cromwell's time, because he didn't believe in royalty, so they would have been ripped down and destroyed, and then were reinstated. That Charles II, 10 years later, said that he wanted royal arms back up in church, and each king had slightly different arms. Like I say, those are William IV's. People often ask, why is Pocklington such a big church? And the usual answer in history has been because of the wool trade. I'm not so sure about that. My view is that the reason Pocklington's a big and important church is because of these two guys. That's Henry I, who was William the Conqueror's middle son, and when his elder brother was shot by a bow and arrow in a hunting accident, and his brother above that was in France, he grabbed the throne. And this is quite a nice picture of him. He was seen as a very wise and forthright king, and so he's pictured there holding Reading Abbey, which is, he built the church there, and a Bible, but he was very much organised the justice of the country. He established fair justice, but there was another side to him. In addition to being quite a religious man and a lawmaker, he had at least 10 mistresses and fathered 25 at least illegitimate children. And his favourite mistress for quite a few years was called Edith from Numbernum. She was clearly from a Viking family because her father was called Fawn Sigulfsson, and he was a Numbernum, fairly small landowner who met William I. William hooked up with his very beautiful daughter and started rewarding Fawn, and established him on what would been part of the Manor of Pocklington on Grimthorpe Hill, just going up to Givendale. And so the Sigurdsfull sons became quite rich and were endowed with lands in Yorkshire and in Cumbria, and William had 2 children with Edith. And then this guy came along, who's called by some people Athelwold and others Adolulf, and he was a Pocklington nobleman who had an estate and a manor house in Pocklington, and he gave them to the church and took holy orders and became William I chaplain and confessor, and was then made Bishop of Carlisle. Nobody's ever been able to really trace who his original identity. I suspect he may have been a relative of Mistress Edith, and that was why he was rewarded so much by Henry during that time. And he, like I say, donated land to the Dean of York just after Henry, who owned the Manor of Pocklington and owned the Church of Pocklington, had given the Church of Pocklington to the Archbishop of York, who had just created a new post of Dean of York, and he then immediately handed it on to the Dean. So the Dean got the Church of Pocklington from Henry I, and then he got an estate of lands out to that side of Pocklington and a manor house down Dean's Lane, where the old school used to be, to live in as well, in addition to all his bigger properties in York. And so for 100 years, just over, the Dean of York was also the rector of Pocklington. And so big churches, and churches much bigger than this, were invariably built by important people, either kings or very rich churchmen. And so some of these guys, who were Deans of York and rectors of Pocklington, were in absentio. They didn't live in the north of England. They were just given the post for the money. other ones were active around here. And so I think the church was expanded in the times. You know, we reckon the original church was built maybe 1120, which is the year that Adolf gave his lands to the Dean of York, and that it was significantly extended and improved round about 1190 when Henry Marshall was the Dean, and he was active around York, and then improved again in the early 1200s. And so I think that's why Pocklington was improved and increased during that time. We'll just go down this place. You don't have to follow me as yet. I'll just come to here. And Pocklington's always been a royalist stronghold, as it were. One of the reasons why we don't have any particularly Sir this or Baron that in Pocklington is that they were fiercely royalist and fervently Catholic. And so, for example, the Dolman family just before the Civil War were knocking on the door of being one of Yorkshire's top 10 families. They had 15,000 acres of lands. A century later, they were just about bankrupt and in debtor's prison and begging for there's one of the Dolmans writing begging letters saying he was in prison in rags. So they were punished for that, but we had this 10 years as a republic. And this is a copy of Pocklington's market charter that was issued by Thomas Cromwell. And it was copied probably about 20-25 years ago by the town council, the originals in the treasure house in Beverley. And they weren't quite on the same wavelength at the town council as the people of Pocklington, because market charters issued by Cromwell are very rare, and in Pocklington is just about unique because Cromwell's portrait would have been in the corner, and the original, they'd cut it off. And the town council thought they were doing a nice job restoring the charter by putting a picture of Cromwell's head back on it. The reason his head had been chopped off was because he was hated in Pocklington. There was one guy shouting in the marketplace, Cromwell is the son of a whore and the commons are fools, and he was arrested and shipped off. And from the pulpit, Marmaduke Richardson, who was the assistant master at Pocklington School and curate of Killick Percy, he kept praying for the health of Charles II, who was exiled in France, and so he got arrested and shipped off. So that showed how Pocklington's fervent royalism was clung on through the years. I've only ever found one reference in a book, never found it in a primary source, but if you look at the difference between the base of that pillar and the base of that pillar, that is obviously much newer and restored. And I found one reference in a book that said there was a pillar in Pocklington Church where Cromwell lit his fire. Well, Cromwell almost certainly never came to Pocklington, but we were in the middle of Hull, which was a parliamentarian stronghold, and York that was a royalist stronghold. And so the parliamentarians came out of Hull and took over in Pocklington, and then in 1642 Newcastle brought his men from York and drove out the parliamentarians, and then William Constable came back again a year later and retook Pocklington when they were on the way to the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which might sound a bit odd to you, but there's been 3 battles of Stamford Bridge. One where King Harold defeated the Vikings. There was another one in the War of the Roses, and a third one during the Civil War as well. But we know that the parliamentarian troops stayed in Pocklington preparing for the battle, so it's probably quite likely that if the weather wasn't that wonderful, that they actually stayed in church. Also within the Civil War, we believe that Charles I came to Pocklington in the early days of the war, and ironically, 200 years later, a hoard of Civil War coins were dug up on the site of the Dolmans Manor House in Pocklington. The Dolmans by then had become bankrupt and left town, and so Robert Denison got the proceeds of a fortune that had literally been under the feet of the Dolmans when their fortunes went to rack and ruin. Is that right? Right, so that was just on that bit. So I'm going now into the south transept. If people want to take a seat here, or you can sit around. Right, there's quite a royal focus in this part of the church, and this is traditionally called Barwick's Aisle, and because it's supposed to have been funded by Thomas de Barwick, who was a rich wool merchant, which is where the story of Pocklington church being built because of the wool trade. Thomas de Barwick, this is his coat of arms on the wall there, and it's 3 bears' heads because he was de Berwick. Sometimes it's spelt with an A, sometimes with an E. And as I said, he was a very rich wool merchant. In fact, he was a member of the English Company in the early 1300s, and Flanders, or Belgium as we know it, that was the biggest cloth producing country in the world, but they had no sheep. And so we provided the wool and they wove the cloth. And so it's often said that in those earlier centuries that wool was like gold. And so there were these 50 very rich wool merchants who gave money to the king, and he gave them licenses to export wool. Thomas de Berwick, one of the things he did was he paid Edward I, he got these licenses, and he had to pay the King of Scotland to stay in Scotland, because for the best part of 300 years we were at war with Scotland, and they used to raid down here, and in 1320s particularly they were very active, and basically maybe some things haven't changed a lot. They would come down. If you gave them money, they would go away. If you didn't, then they would burn your church down. And Skirton Beck and I think Baint and Church, possibly Middleton on the Wolds, were all destroyed by Scottish raids. The reason when you drive into Beverley that there is a bar there was because Beverley had to pay them to go away and then built the wall round in case they came back again. And in Pocklington we had enough money and so we paid off the Scots. And so that will have been, de Bowick was already supposed to be paying them not to come here, so we probably paid them off and then he gave them more money not to come back. This little arch in the wall there, I'm pretty sure would originally have been for a figure of Thomas de Berwick. It might have been stone planned or it might have been wooden. I don't think his effigy ever got there. He disappeared from view. There's loads about him in the Royal Archives, but then he disappeared from view round about 1350, which was the time of the Black Death. And I suspect that he died during the plague, and so the plans for his glorious tomb were not carried out. This brass here probably again had his arms on, and that will have been a little effigy in there of him and his wife. So that was Thomas de Berwick, who he lost quite a bit of his money because he kept paying Edward, and then he lent him some and didn't get it back again, so his fortunes declined somewhat. But these are a king and queen, and that's Henry the Third and his wife Eleanor of Provence. And I haven't been able to work out, they were carved by William Scaife, Richard's father, in about 1810, and they were carved out of a beam because the roof had been restored that was thought to have been from round about the 1320s when Henry was king. He married Eleanor in 1236. He was 29, she was shipped over from France, she was 13, and it might be a big modern thing where they have these programs called Married at First Sight. Well, that's nothing new, because the first time Henry set eyes on Eleanor was in Westminster Abbey for their wedding, but they were a very close couple. They were devoted to each other, and Pocklington comes into the story because Henry gave her the manor of Pocklington as a dowry, and he gave her few quid as well in cash, but she got the manor of Pocklington and the manor of Kensington in London as part of the dowry payment. I do wonder whether or not, maybe when they did the restoration, maybe the beam that he carved those out of had a date on it, and that was why he did the heads of Henry and Eleanor, because I don't think it was known at that time that she'd been the lady of the manor of Pocklington. So, and I'll go over the other side, so we're in the 1300s here, and we're moving over this side to the Tudors. And this is the memorial of Roger Sotheby, and he did quite well for himself. The Sotheby's and the Dolmans were the two of the three main families in the mid-Tudor era, and he backed the right horse, that he was the steward for the Cliffords at Lonsborough and Bolton and Skipton, where the Dolmans, as we'll hear in a little while, backed the wrong horse. And so the Sotheby family did very nicely. Pocklington was quite a mucky, smelly place because of all the tanning and brewing, and so he made enough to move up market and move the family to Birdsall. But his memorial is almost like a family tree, and if you look down the sides there, and come back sometime and have a closer look, there's lots of little quartered coats of arms of the Sotheby family and his sons and daughters that he married, that they married, sorry. The one at the top was the other main family, and Roger Sotheby's daughter Anne married John Bishop, not the comedian. He was the grandson of Thomas Bishop, who Henry VIII had given the manor of Pocklington because he negotiated a peace treaty between England and Scotland. Bishop was a Scottish lawyer, and he was quite devious and irascible, and he swapped sides depending on which way the wind was blowing. Henry VIII rewarded him with lands, Edward gave him more land, Queen Mary gave him a pension, and then Elizabeth I put him in the Tower of London twice and executed his son. And so this is the oldest man in Pocklington. This is Thomas Bishop's son, also Thomas Bishop, and he took part in the revolt of the Northern Earls, which was an attempt to put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne and instead of Elizabeth, and it was an abject failure. And Thomas Bishop the elder, he got his head split open by a billhook near Carlisle, and Elizabeth was so keen on and wanting to find out what he knew that she sent her personal surgeon all the way from London up to Carlisle to keep him alive, and shipped him down to the Tower of London. His son, who went to Pocklington School and got a Dolman scholarship and went to Cambridge Uni and then came back to Pocklington, he wasn't as lucky. He was hung, drawn, beheaded and quartered, which was the standard practice for men who were found guilty of treason. Sounds a bit iffy. They were hung until they turned blue but were still alive, cut down, waited till they coughed and spluttered a bit. That was the hung bit. And then the drawn bit was they were cut open and their intestines pulled out and burnt in front of them as long as while they were still alive. And then finally at the next stage you were beheaded, and that's his head that was put on a spike on one of the bars of York, and the rest of him was chopped into 4 quarters, and one of the quarters sent back to Pocklington and hung on the market cross, just to let everybody know that Elizabeth I was the boss, and there was a reminder there. So that's Thomas Bishop Jr. There's another remnant of somebody that didn't get on particularly well with Elizabeth. Just under there's a skull and crossbones gravestone, and that's the granddaughter of Richard Langley. He hasn't got a grave because he was harbouring Catholic priest at Grimthorpe, and he was executed in York. He's a Catholic martyr, but his family asked if they could bury him, and they were refused permission for that. So there's no gravestone for Richard Langley, even though he's the blessed Richard Langley, but his granddaughter's gravestone's just the other side there. So I'm going to go up now into the Lady Chapel. If you mind the wiring, you could go that way or follow me up here, and we'll go up here. There's chairs up here as well if people want. He really seems to settle on quite what to call this part of the church. Sometimes it's called the Lady Chapel, sometimes it's called the Dolman Chapel. I think it really should be called the de Pocklington Chapel, because it was actually founded and paid for by the de Pocklington family, who were stewards and sheriffs for the Count of Aumale of Holderness. But it then became the Dolman Chapel, and this is the memorial of Thomas Dolman, who's that guy there on our illustration, and his wife, who's Elizabeth Vavasour. And unfortunately, it looks pretty sort of bleak, does that, but so we had a coloured illustration done. So it's Thomas Dolman and Elizabeth Vavasour and his 5 sons and 3 daughters. And Thomas Dolman was what's called a church recusant. So he was Catholic, but you were fined for being Catholic, and you were unable to hold public office in Elizabethan times, and he was a lawyer, so he came to church and his wife didn't, because she had nothing to lose. The husband owned the land, she was an heiress, but as soon as they got married, then all her lands transferred to Thomas Dolman. She was a Vavasour, which is one of the most important Catholic families in the country. If you're ever going to Leeds and you've got a bit of time to kill, between Tadcaster and Leeds is a place called Hazelwood Castle, which is a biggish stately home that is now a wedding venue. If you branch off and go and have a look, they've got the chapel attached to the house is basically a Catholic church, and because the Vavasours were so well in with Elizabeth, they were allowed to keep their chapel when all other Catholic churches were banned. And so it's the only place that we know about that was continuously a Catholic church, and was Elizabeth gave strict orders that they were left alone. It's got a couple of martyr skulls in there if you like that sort of thing. But Thomas Dolman, he was the bailiff and steward for the Earl and Countess of Lennox, who crossed. They were important nobles in Scotland who came over to this side. They were the grandparents of James I, and Thomas Dolman's son, Robert, he was knighted by James I just after he came to the throne, and was well in at that time, although he was Catholic. James, the Archbishop of York was told not to indict him for anything because he was too important. but then his cousins, two of them were gunpowder plotters, and so they went downhill after that. So he lost some of his land. But like I say, he was very much within the court of particularly in Mary's time. The Countess of Lennox was Mary's maid of honour and was actually named as her successor to the crown at one stage. So he was right in the middle of court in London, and then when Elizabeth became queen, became more and more distant. And like I say, the Dolmans came closer again, initially under James, and then got pushed out again as again their beliefs became more and more unpopular. Thomas Dolman is that guy. That's John Dolman on the left, who was also a lawyer, and he was the guy who founded Pocklington School and was extremely wealthy. He became Archdeacon of Suffolk because he was a good administrator, and in Henry VII and Henry VIII they realised that the best administrators, best politicians were usually churchmen, and so John Dolman, his boss, was Bishop Fox, who was Henry VIII's chief minister, and then when he retired, Dolman took on as a servant of Thomas Wolsey. And Thomas Wolsey was obviously made a cardinal. He was also made Archbishop of York, and that was a way of just rewarding people. Wolsey was Archbishop of York for 16 years and never came to York in that time. So, it was literally money for old rope. And like I say, these guys became incredibly wealthy. The dozen guys who were deans of York and rectors of Pocklington, 2 of them became archbishops, 2 of them became chancellors of England, and 5 of them became bishops. So money was literally thrown at them, and so if they wanted to spend it on churches, that wasn't a problem with that. That's again, the Dolman arms. That's the Vavasor arms within that. Back to another coat of arms on the Sotheby memorial. I told you about Bishop, and his arms are the 3 lions at the top of that Sotheby memorial. The one at the top on the left-hand side was that another of Roger Sotheby's daughters married a guy called William Oglethorpe here in Pocklington Church. And William Oglethorpe's uncle, Owen Oglethorpe, he actually carried out the coronation of Elizabeth I. He was the Bishop of Carlisle, but he was basically the only bishop she could get. All the ones more senior than that were either in prison or refused to crown her, because she'd just gone from Mary, who was a Catholic queen, to Elizabeth, who reinstated a Anglican regime. And so one after one got crossed out, and it got down to Owen Oglethorpe. He wasn't particularly happy to carry it out, but he said yes, and he was under strict instructions not to what's called elevate the host and lift the host up before he gave it to the Queen. He defied her and did that, and she got up and walked out of her own coronation. she'd been given the crown by then, so it was in the later stages. But Oglethorpe, he kept his life, but he didn't get promotion after that. But like I say, it was his nephew was married here soon after that in Pocklington Church. So, and we'll move on to the 19th century for a finish. Move some of those chairs so people can get by easier. That's all right. Oh, you can get round that way. This is the memorial of the Denison family. The Denisons were a rich family of wool merchants in Leeds, and Robert Denison didn't really like working in city commerce. He preferred a country life, and so he bought Killick-Percy, built the current hall there in the 1760s, and then in 1792 he bought the manor of Pocklington from the bankrupt Dolmans. And he, I was looking and thinking, well, there must be some sort of connection with the Denisons and royalty. So I started digging, and I came across what is probably my favourite coronation story, in that he and his family were wool merchants from Leeds. If you've been to a posh do at Leeds University, that might well have been in Denison Hall, which was the Denison family main home in Leeds that ended up as part of the university. But like I say, he came to Pocklington and became a country squire. Other members of the family stayed in Leeds and stayed in the wool trade, but one branch of the family went south and became bankers in London and became phenomenally rich in running a bank. And one of them, his daughter, set her stall out to be George IV's mistress. And so Robert Denison's cousin was Elizabeth Denison, who became Elizabeth Cunningham, and she was hitched up for the marriage of convenience, and her and her husband were moved into Windsor Castle. And by the time George IV was crowned, his marriage to Caroline of Brunswick was finished, really. And so he was crowned in 1820. He gave strict instructions that the Queen couldn't come to the coronation. And she turned up anyway, and so he had the doors of Westminster Abbey closed in her face, and so there was Queen Caroline banging on the door. Inside, George IV was being crowned, and Elizabeth Cunningham, Robert's cousin, was sat on the front row, and the reports of the coronation service say that George IV was sat on his throne and he kept nodding and winking to his mistress in the front row while his wife was outside banging on the door. Which, when I said earlier on that there are more controversial coronations than our current kings, then I don't think you'll be able to beat that. The other part of the 19th century of Pocklington is that west window is a memorial, sorry, that's the east window, is a memorial to Admiral Duncombe. And unfortunately, the Denison family died out, Robert Denison Sr. had a son called Robert Denison. He had two sons, another Robert, who died young, and there he died at the age of 5, and the other son joined the army, and he fought in the Indian Mutiny, and he was badly wounded in the relief of the siege of Lucknow, and died of his wounds. And so there was nobody to pass the manor of Pocklington on to, and Admiral Duncombe bought it. He was the 4th son of the Earl of Feversham, and so he's fairly well down in the succession within the family. But either his elder brothers either died young, didn't have children, one was killed in First World War, and so it's Admiral Duncombe of Killickpercy and Pocklington who are his descendants are the current Earls of Feversham, and live at Duncombe Park, and that's his window. The part of the church that you're in was extensively restored by him in the 1860s, just after his brother became the Dean of York. But the previous dean had actually sold the dean's manor that had been given to the dean way back in 1120. Coburn, the dean, he sold it to Admiral Duncombe just before his brother became the next dean. And so this part of the church is down to Admiral Duncombe. The royal connections there are a bit tenuous. His father had been raised to the peerage by George IV, and Admiral Duncombe, everybody knows the phrase ladies in waiting, but they used to have grooms in waiting as well. And so he was a groom in waiting for Queen Victoria for 5 years before he then came up to Killickpercy. So we've now covered Pocklington's royal connections from 1107, when the church was given over here by the king, all the way up to 1889, when Admiral Duncombe died. Thank you.